Chapter 17, Tangled Loyalties. I remember being escorted to D7 for the first time, wondering what to expect when I finally entered the pod. I was hoping I'd know somebody there, hoping to get lucky and end up around some other good Northerners. Prior to having left San Quentin, one of the things my neighbor Sal explained to me was the door policy and what I was supposed to do in the event my door opened while the enemy was out on the tier. This ran through my mind, and I wondered if I'd ever be put in that situation. I wasn't worried about hand-to-hand combat, as I had become pretty efficient at fighting with my hands. But I knew I had to be on my toes, because these Southerners and white guys who had been there for a while definitely had weapons. The policy at the time was real simple. If my door opened while any of the opposition was out on the tier, I was to engage with no questions asked. It's called torpedoing out of your cell. This would later change, but at this time in the early 90s, the SHU was considered to be a high-level battle zone. As the officers escorted me into the pod, I looked in all the cells as I walked by. I didn't recognize anyone, nor did anyone call my name. As luck would have it, I didn't know anybody in my pod. I was given a mattress, my standard issue of clothing, a blanket, and a standard fish kit. After giving my issue, they closed my food port and left the pod. While getting situated in my cell, I moved around quietly trying to listen for any conversations on the tier between the other cells about my arrival. I was also waiting for what I knew would come next. More than likely, either my neighbor or somebody else would ask where I came from and try to identify my loyalties. Since I was Hispanic, it was easy to assume that I was either a norteño or a sureño. And then it came. My neighbor asked, "Hey, you who just came in?" I said, "Hey." He responded, "Hey, where you coming from, homie?" I said, "San Quentin." He said, "Are you a Southsider?" I quickly responded, "No, I'm a norteño." He said, "Okay, my name's Chato from Baldwin Park. If you need anything, let me know." I said, "All right, gracias." "Hey, they call me Boxer." He said, "All right, Boxer, mucho gusto." Spanish for pleasure meeting you. I said, "All right, likewise." And that was it. I was finally in the SHU, and this was where I was going to stay. There were no other norteños or blacks in my pod. Most of the cells in my pod were occupied by sureños. Later, I'd find out there were a few in the other pods, but I was basically by myself. There were two Aryan Brotherhood AB members below me, Frank and Beaver. There was a Tejano Texas Syndicate member named Bandit from Modesto, and another guy named Ray Hernandez from Hayward, a Sureño sympathizer. I'd find out later that he was setting up norteños on the main lines to be hit by the Sureños, and my people had him labeled as a high priority target. Bandit was the one who put me up on him, and he was somewhat the only ally I had in that pod. He was a norteño sympathizer, as the Texas Syndicate was enemies with the M and the Sureños. He was also the pod porter, so he was able to come out, sweep and mop once a day, and talk directly to me at my door. Later that night, when the Sureños did their evening roll call, I noticed that they included Ray. Roll calls are done once in the morning to say good morning and once at night to say good night. It's a practice that's performed to demonstrate unity within different groups and as a showing of mutual respect. This incensed me, and I actually despised Ray more than the Sureños or the ABs in the pod. These are the worst kind of degenerates to encounter, a turncoat northerner who has worked alongside the enemy, preying on his own people. Even though I'd walk by everyone selling the pod and greet them as a show of common respect, I never looked in Ray's direction and refused to acknowledge him. A couple months later, after settling in, I was watching TV when I heard the front pod gate open and saw one of the floor officers come walking in. I watched him as he walked up the stairs and came straight to my cell. When he got to my door, he said they were trying to make some room for incoming buses and asked if it was okay if he set me up with Hernandez in cell 211, Ray Hernandez. My mind started spinning, thinking this was my opportunity to get this fool. Without hesitation, I said, "Yeah, that's my homie. I'm good with it. Should I pack my stuff?" He said, "Well, let me go ask him first, and then I'll let you know." Ray was on the yard. I watched the floor officer walk back down the stairs toward the yard door and out of my view. I literally stood with my ear to the door trying to hear Ray's response, but I couldn't hear a word. The tension in the pod was so thick, it could literally be cut with a knife. Everybody obviously knew what was about to happen. The other Southsiders in the pod knew that me and Ray were staunch enemies. They all heard the conversation I had with the floor officer, especially since I purposely talked loud. But this cop was oblivious to what he was arranging. Since Ray was a Sureño sympathizer, I assumed he was classified as a Sureño. But he was from Northern California, and they still had him listed as a Northerner. I could only hear what the CO asked. Do you have a problem selling up with Mendoza in 209? But since the door to the yard was closed, I couldn't hear any of Ray's responses. When the CO exited the pod, I began pacing back and forth to myself, thinking how I was going to do this. That sick, irritable feeling in my stomach returned, the same feeling that always surfaced whenever I was getting ready to fight or commit some type of abhorrent act. But he was a huge target, and I couldn't help but focus on the recognition I get from smashing this guy. My thought process turned to fashioning a weapon and the possibility of him having one or being given one by the other Sureños when he came in off the yard. For a split second, I thought about breaking my TV and fashioning a makeshift weapon real quick. But then I heard the yard door open and I knew I didn't have enough time. Either way, I wasn't worried about fighting this guy. He was shorter than me and stocky, but now I was huge and probably in the best shape of my life. One of my best attributes has always been my size. I've always been healthy and I kept my size. My arms never got smaller than 18 inches, but at the time I was packing 20s and all I did was work out. It's never wise to underestimate somebody based on size alone, but I was confident that I'd knock the dust off this fool's block. When Ray came in from the yard, I watched him walk to the front grill gate and have another conversation with the tier officer. Again, I strained to catch any part of their conversation, but he was whispering so low I couldn't make anything out he said. As soon as he got back to his cell and his door closed, it would be the first and only time I spoke to him. I asked, "Hey Ray, are you coming down here or am I going down there?" My question was twofold and I purposely posed it that way. It served as a direct threat, and I was fishing to see if the move was actually going to happen or not. I was suspicious about Ray putting something in the CO's ear to cancel out the move. In situations like this, neither of us had any reason to whisper anything to the canines, and there was really nothing else to say, but that we were okay with the move. Any deviation from this was suspect, but that obviously isn't what happened. He said something to stop the move, and everyone in the pod knew it. It was just one of them things that was kind of obvious. It was evident, and that in itself was a small victory alone. He basically pissed all over himself. Ray said, "I don't know." He said he was going to come back and let me know. I just laughed to myself. It shouldn't have surprised me that Ray was a coward, but I afforded him more credit than he actually deserved. I never spoke to this dude again. It became a little obvious that he'd even lost some respect from the Sureños and the white guys from that day on. One day when Frank and Beaver were on the tier using the hair clippers, I watched Frank as he pulled a strip of steel off one of the stairs in the pod. The strip was as long as the entire stair, and probably enough to break up and make enough pieces to give all the Sureños. It was solid steel too, and definitely something I had to be concerned about. Those weapons had the potential to kill. I knew I really had to be on my toes now. Because of the door policy, I made a practice of rolling up my mattress and sitting by my door whenever there would be any movement on the tiers such as yard, law library, showers, or haircuts. The Sureños and the ABs could walk by and see me sitting there, so this was almost like dry signaling that I was ready to engage with my door open. We still showed each other a measure of respect by acknowledging each other, exchanging reading material, and offering each other canteen items. But we also knew where each other stood if the doors ever opened. The days seemed to pass by pretty quickly, and before I knew it, I was already 6 months into my violation. One day, while sitting back thinking about the short 28 days I spent on the streets, I thought back to the day I met Connie at La Raza Park with my boy Chewy and how good she looked. She was my pen pal from Susanville. I thought I remembered her address but wasn't completely sure. I figured I'd take a chance. She was definitely worth taking a chance on, so I wrote her. I ended up getting a response back 2 or 3 weeks later. I was on cloud 9 and wasn't about to lose contact with this girl ever again. A couple months later, 2 of the sureños in my pod ended up moving to another block and 2 northerners moved into their cell. Frank Pancho Baca from Sacramento and Jaime Black Corpus from Fresno. Bandit knew Pancho but hadn't seen him for years. It wasn't even 5 minutes after they walked into the pod that Pancho was at my door and identified himself and his cellie as both being NF members. I had never been around any seasoned C's up until this point. I just heard a lot about how they carried themselves and that they were very disciplined. So I even thought it was kind of out of character for him to expose his hand to me that early in the game, especially since he didn't know who I was or anything about me. Yet, I had no reason to doubt his assertions and treated them both like my superiors. I started going over a variety of different educational topics with them, and they had me pumping out 2,500 word essays a week on NF related concepts. Pancho said he would start grooming me to become a C, and I eagerly began absorbing and soaking up the material. I gathered an extensive amount of schooling up until this point, but the majority of it centered around the NR and the Norteño movement. These topics I was being exposed to were much more intensive and contained a rigid formula of developing leadership skills, business acumen, and counterattacking law enforcement tactics, areas that would promise success and push forward the NF street objectives. I was already aspiring to be an NF member from the time I committed myself to the NR, as this was at the crescendo of what I was striving for. However, I began noticing shady characteristics in these guys, and the way they were conducting themselves made me suspicious about their true status. One day, while playing a game of chess over the tier with Jaime, I got a little frustrated over how his pieces kept ending up on the wrong squares and how this always seemed to benefit him. For me, playing chess was nothing more than a viable way to pass the time and stimulate the mind, but it made no sense in playing if I couldn't get a fair game. Ultimately, after numerous games of this happening, I ended up conceding and told Jaime I was retiring my board. I said, "It's starting to get old playing with you when your pieces keep moving around by themselves." Pancho jumped up and said, "Set your board up, boxer. We're going to play one more game for 1,022 counts to be done immediately after the game." I said, "I'm done with all that. I'm going to kick back." Pancho replied, "It's not an option. Set your board up." This was said openly over the tier, and by now the whole pod was listening to what was turning into a confrontation. Now my ego and pride were getting the best of me. "I'm not setting my board up, so go ahead and run that game with your celly." Pancho said, "If you don't set your board up, ya estuvo." Spanish for "that's it, you're done." I said, "I guess that's what it is then." Even though things seemed a little suspicious about these two guys, I wasn't sure of their status. But either way, I had just blatantly defied them. Over the next 2 days, we didn't speak a word to each other, but I was trying to figure out a way to cover my ass. So I asked one of the sureños how to go about signing up for the law library. The library was the only way to communicate with other blocks, and this was where most of the communication used to take place. In the 90s, before they changed it, they would run guys to the law library from different blocks, so you had action at running into everybody. But up until recently, they started running one block at a time to curtail the communication. This was another thing that made me suspicious. Although Pancho and Jaime claimed to be part of the NF governing body, neither one of them ever signed up for the law library. Communication would have been vital for them if they were in fact part of the leadership structure. This prompted Pancho to shoot me a kite the very next time he passed by my door on his way to the shower. He was basically trying to make amends and gave a long explanation about there being a major split in the leadership and why it wasn't a good idea for me to go to the law library. He was obviously worried about something. All that stood out to me was that they didn't want me to go to the law library. But why? Maybe because I'd find out they were no good. Now my suspicions were peaking, and I could see that Pancho and Jaime were both acting like they were real vulnerable. My suspicions were confirmed about a week later. One of the ABs, Frank, went to the law library and apparently ran into Joseph Pinky Hernandez from Cucamonga and Cornelio Corny Tristan from Woodland. I'd never met these guys, but had heard enough about them to know that they were both part of the leadership who were indicted in the early 90s. When Frank passed my cell, He slid a kite under my door and said, "This is a message from your homeboys Corny and Pinky about those two dudes downstairs." Apparently, this AB Frank took it upon himself to tell Corny and Pinky about these two guys because he understood the position I was in. The message was that Pancho and Jaime were both NFDOs, dropouts. They were poisoned and not to be fooled or misled by their deceptive tactics. I was both relieved and upset, but I didn't let them know I was on to them. I knew Jaime was getting ready to parole in a couple weeks, and I was hoping I could persuade Pancho into letting me move in with him. My plan was to hit him once I got in the cell with him, but Pancho wasn't stupid, and I think he figured out that Frank had passed the message to me. When Jaime finally paroled, I purposely propositioned Pancho openly over the tier about selling up together. I wanted everybody in the pod to overhear the response I already knew was coming. Pancho said, "No, I already got somebody playing with another one of my homies." I just smiled and said to myself, "Fucking coward." I paroled in May 1993 back to San Francisco. All I kept thinking about was how good it was going to be to finally be able to see Connie. She kept riding me up until I paroled, and now she was about to become my reality.